I don't care what those permits say. Karen Whitmore's voice cracked across the December morning air, her finger jabbing toward the 6-foot cedar fence that separated David Chen's backyard from the common area. This is a violation of Section 4.2 of our community guidelines, and I'm calling the police. David stood on his back deck, coffee mug in hand, watching the HOA president's face turn crimson beneath her perfectly styled blonde hair. Behind her, 3 other board members nodded in agreement, their breath forming clouds in the 28-degree air. What had started as a quiet Saturday morning in Millbrook Estates was quickly spiraling into something far more serious. Mrs. Whitmore, I have all the documentation, David began, but she cut him off with a dismissive wave. I don't want to hear it. You people think you can just move into our neighborhood and change everything. The words hung in the air like ice crystals, and David felt the familiar knot form in his stomach. 23 years in this country, 15 in this neighborhood, and he was still you people. The first police cruiser arrived within minutes, followed by a second. Officer Martinez emerged from the lead vehicle, his hand resting casually on his belt as he approached the growing crowd. David had seen him before at community events. He lived 2 streets over, and had a daughter on the high school soccer team that David's construction company had sponsored for 3 years running. What seems to be the problem here? Martinez asked, to his eyes scanning the fence that had become the center of controversy. This fence is illegal, Karen declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. It violates multiple HOA regulations, and I demand you make him tear it down immediately. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, his movements deliberate and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Inside were building permits, architectural reviews, and correspondence dating back 6 months. Every document bore official stamps and signatures. Every regulation had been followed to the letter. Officer Martinez, I believe we met at the school fundraiser last spring, David said, extending the folder. Everything here is in order. The fence was approved by the city, the HOA Architectural Committee, and meets all zoning requirements. Martinez flipped through the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. Behind him, more neighbors had gathered, some supportive, others skeptical. The Johnsons from next door stood firmly behind David. They had been there the day he'd broken ground, had seen the tears in his eyes as he'd explained that this was the last project his wife, Sarah, had planned before her cancer diagnosis 8 months ago. These permits look legitimate, Martinez said finally, looking up at Karen. The fence appears to be within all legal parameters. That's impossible. Karen snatched the folder from his hands, her carefully manicured nails clicking against the paper. The height restrictions clearly state. The height restrictions allow for 6-foot privacy fencing on residential lots over half an acre. David interrupted quietly. My lot is 0.7 acres. I've measured it 3 times. The second officer, a younger man named Rodriguez, had been walking the perimeter of the fence with a measuring tape. 6 feet exactly, he called out, and the setback from the property line. His correct to Karen's face had gone from red to purple. This is ridiculous. I'm the HOA president, and I'm telling you this fence is illegal. Are you going to do your job or not? Martinez's demeanor shifted, his professional courtesy hardening into something more authoritative. Ma'am, I understand your concerns, but the documentation is clear. Mr. Chen has followed all proper procedures. There's no violation here. No violation. Karen's voice rose to nearly a shriek. He's destroying the character of our neighborhood. Property values are going to plummet. This is exactly what I warned everyone about when these people started moving in. The mask had slipped completely now, and David felt the familiar weight of being judged not for his actions, but for his ancestry. He thought of the community garden he'd helped establish, the scholarship fund his company had created for local students, the countless volunteer hours he'd donated to the very neighborhood association that was now attacking him. I think we're done here, Martinez said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mr. Chen, your fence is perfectly legal. Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest you review your HOA documents more carefully before making future complaints. As the officers walked back to their vehicles, Karen turned to David with unveiled hatred in her eyes. This isn't over, she hissed. I know exactly who you are, and I know what you're trying to do to this neighborhood. We'll see how long you last here. David watched her storm away, her followers trailing behind like ducklings. He didn't know it yet, but Karen Whitmore had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because David Chen wasn't just a grieving widower trying to honor his wife's memory. He was the owner of Chen Construction, the company that had built half the homes in Millbrook Estates. He was on the City Planning Commission, the school board, and had been quietly considering a run for city council. More importantly, he had spent the last 6 months meticulously documenting every interaction with the HOA, every email, every phone call, every instance of selective enforcement and discriminatory treatment. What Karen saw as a simple fence dispute was actually the tip of an iceberg that was about to sink her entire operation. The December wind whipped through the cedar slats of the fence, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of a storm. David pulled his jacket tighter and walked back toward his house, where boxes of documentation waited in his home office. 6 months of careful preparation were about to pay off, and Karen Whitmore had just given him the perfect opening. Inside the warm kitchen, David poured himself another cup of coffee and opened his laptop. The first email was to his attorney, a woman who specialized in civil rights and housing discrimination. The second was to the investigative reporter at the local newspaper, who had been asking questions about HOA corruption for months. The third was to the mayor's office, where David's name carried considerable weight after his company had completed the new municipal building project 6 months ahead of schedule and $2.3 million under budget. Karen Whitmore thought she was dealing with just another resident she could bully into submission. She had no idea she had just declared war on one of the most influential men in the city. Asterisk, asterisk, the backstory unfolds. Asterisk, asterisk, 3 days later. David sat in his home office, surrounded by banker's boxers and manila folders, each one meticulously labeled and dated. The room that had once been Sarah's art studio still smelled faintly of oil paints and turpentine. But now it served as command central for what was rapidly becoming the most significant fight of his life. The fence wasn't just a fence, it was Sarah's final gift to him, her last attempt to create the private garden sanctuary she had dreamed of since they'd moved to Millbrook Estates 15 years ago. The architectural plans, drawn in her own careful handwriting, sat framed on his desk next to a photo of them breaking ground on their first construction project 25 years earlier. "Remember when we were young and stupid enough to think hard work and following the rules was all it took?" he whispered to her photo, his fingers tracing the glass. The harassment had started small. A letter in March questioning his choice of mailbox color. Another in April about the exotic plants Sarah had ordered for their garden native Texas. Wildflowers that apparently looked too wild for the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. By May, Karen was showing up at his door weekly, clipboard in hand, finding violations that somehow never seemed to apply to other residents. Mrs. Patterson, 3 houses down, had installed a fountain that violated noise ordinances. But Karen called it charming. Hendersons had painted their shutters a color not approved by the architectural committee, but that was deemed an honest mistake. When David had applied for permission to install landscape lighting, the same lighting that graced half the homes in the development, his application had been rejected for excessive illumination. The pattern was clear, but David had been too consumed with Sarah's illness to fight it. Chemotherapy appointments, radiation treatments, and the desperate search for experimental trials had consumed his days. The HOA harassment had felt like a minor annoyance compared to watching his wife of 22 years slowly fade away. Sarah had passed on a Tuesday in September, her hand in his as autumn light streamed through the hospital windows. 2 days later, while David was still numb with grief, Karen had shown up at his door with a citation for failure to maintain lawn standards because his grass had grown 2 inches too long. That was when David had started documenting everything. The first breakthrough came when he'd run into Alina Vasquez at the grocery store in October. Alina worked in the city planning office and had processed his fence permit application. Over coffee, she'd mentioned something that made his blood run cold. "You know, your application was perfect," she'd said, stirring sugar into her latte. "But that HOA president called 3 times trying to get us to reject it. She kept saying there had to be some violation she could use to stop you. What did you tell her?" "The truth, that you'd followed every regulation to the letter." She got pretty angry, started making comments about maintaining neighborhood character and property values. Alina had lowered her voice. "Between you and me, she said some things about Asian families that made me very uncomfortable." David had thanked her and gone home to his files. If Karen was actively trying to sabotage his permits, there had to be a paper trail. City employees were required to document all communications with HOA representatives, and David still had friends in the planning office from his years in construction. The records request had yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Karen had contacted city offices 47 times in the past year, always about David's property or permit applications. She'd questioned his tree removal permits, his irrigation system installation, even his application to install a new electrical outlet for holiday decorations. Most damning were the recorded phone calls. Texas was a one-party consent state, meaning Alina and her colleagues were legally allowed to record conversations with HOA representatives for their own protection. David had listened to hours of Karen's voice, growing more aggressive and overtly discriminatory with each call. "These people don't understand our community standards," she'd told the zoning office. "They have different ideas about appropriate landscaping and property maintenance. We need to be more careful about who we let change the character of our neighborhood." When the permits officer had asked for clarification, Karen had been more explicit. "I'm not being racist, but Asian families tend to have different aesthetic preferences. We need to maintain the American suburban ideal that makes Millbrook Estates so desirable." David had played that recording 3 times, each repetition, strengthening his resolve. This wasn't about a fence or landscaping or property maintenance. This was about a woman who had decided that he and his family didn't belong in her neighborhood, and who was using her position of power to make their lives miserable. The investigation had expanded from there. Public records showed that Karen had been HOA president for 8 years, during which time the neighborhood had gone from 37% minority residents to 22%. Property turnover was highest among Asian and Hispanic families, many of whom had sold their homes after extended battles with the HOA over violations. That seemed to disappear when the properties were purchased by white families. David's construction company had built 12 homes in Millbrook Estates over the past decade. 7 had been purchased by minority families, and 6 of those families had received multiple HOA violations within their first year of residence. The pattern was undeniable, and David had the documentation to prove it. But the most shocking discovery had come when he'd cross-referenced Karen's citations with city records. 3 of the families she'd driven out of the neighborhood had sold their homes to Whitmore Properties LLC, a company owned by Karen's husband. The homes had been purchased below market value, given minor cosmetic updates, and resold at significant profits. Karen wasn't just a racist. She was running a sophisticated scheme to manipulate property values and drive out minority families so her husband's company could profit from their desperation. The fence had simply been the final straw. Asterisk, asterisk. The investigation, asterisk, asterisk, Detective Sarah Kim had been working financial crimes for 12 years, but she'd never seen a case quite like this one. The complaint had come through the district attorney's office on a Thursday morning in January, accompanied by 3 boxes of meticulously organized evidence and a cover letter from one of the city's most respected construction contractors. "Housing discrimination with a side of fraud," she'd muttered to her partner. Detective Williams, as they'd spread David Chen's documentation across their conference table, "This is either the most elaborate revenge plot I've ever seen, or we've got a real problem in Millbrook Estates." The initial review had taken 6 hours. David had provided financial records, correspondence, recorded phone calls, property transfer documents, and a detailed timeline spanning 18 months. Every claim was supported by primary source documentation, every allegation backed by official records. "Guys more thorough than most attorneys," Williams had observed. Flipping through bank statements that showed suspicious patterns in property purchases by Whitmore Properties LLC, either he's been planning this for years, or he's just really good at covering his bases. The investigation had started with the recorded phone calls. Karen Whitmore's voice, preserved in digital format by the city planning office, provided clear evidence of discriminatory intent. But it was the financial records that had revealed the full scope of the scheme. Whitmore Properties LLC had been incorporated in Delaware in 2018, with Karen's husband Robert as the sole shareholder. The company had purchased 17 properties. In Millbrook Estates over the past 4 years, all from families who had received multiple HOA violations. The average purchase price was 22% below market value, suggesting sellers were motivated by factors beyond simple economics. Detective Kim had interviewed 12 of the previous homeowners, and their stories were remarkably consistent. Excessive HOA scrutiny, selective enforcement of regulations, and a pattern of harassment that escalated until families felt they had no choice but to leave the neighborhood. The Martinez family had been cited for inappropriate holiday decorations. After installing lights that were identical to those used by their neighbors, that were apparently the wrong shade of red, the Johnsons, an African-American family, had received 17 citations in 8 months, including violations for having too many cars in their driveway during their daughter's high school graduation party. All had sold their homes to Whitmore Properties LLC at significant losses. It's a classic blockbusting scheme, Detective Kim had explained to the DA's office. Use harassment and intimidation to drive out minority families, then profit from their distressed sales. The only difference is they're using an HOA instead of traditional real estate tactics. The deeper they dug, the more connections they found. Karen Whitmore served on the board of directors for the Millbrook Estates Community Association, but she also held a real estate license and had been the listing agent for several properties that were later purchased by her husband's company. She had access to confidential financial information about residents, including mortgage details and property tax assessments, which she used to identify vulnerable families. The pattern was clear: target minority families with excessive HOA enforcement, create a hostile environment that motivated them to sell, then profit from their distress through below-market purchases. The scheme had generated an estimated $1.8 million in profits for Whitmore Properties, LLC, over 4 years. But the case had taken a dramatic turn when Detective Kim had discovered Karen's communications with other HOA presidents in the region. Email records showed that she had been sharing her techniques with board members in 6 other subdivisions, creating a network of discriminatory enforcement that stretched across 3 counties. We're not just looking at one rogue HOA president, Kim had told the DA. This is an organized conspiracy to manipulate housing markets through discriminatory practices. We've identified at least 47 families who were targeted using similar methods. The evidence was overwhelming, but Detective Kim knew that Karen Whitmore's defense would likely focus on the legitimacy of HOA enforcement. She had been careful to cite actual violations, even if those violations were selectively enforced. The discrimination was subtle, hidden behind legitimate-seeming regulations and procedures. That was why David Chen's case was so crucial. His documentation was flawless, his compliance with regulations complete. More importantly, his standing in the community made him a credible witness who couldn't be easily dismissed or intimidated. The investigation had also revealed something else. David Chen wasn't just a construction contractor. He was a licensed professional engineer, a member of the City Planning Commission, and had been quietly working behind the scenes to address housing discrimination issues for years. His company had a track record of building affordable housing and working with minority-owned businesses, and he had personally mentored dozens of young professionals in the construction industry. Karen Whitmore had picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. Community Division, the story broke on a Tuesday morning in February, splashed across the front page of the Millbrook Herald under the headline, HOA President Accused of Housing Discrimination Scheme. By Wednesday, the neighborhood was in chaos. David had been expecting the media attention. The story had been picked up by regional news outlets, and by Thursday morning, a television crew was parked outside his house. The neighborhood had split into 3 distinct camps: those who supported David, those who defended Karen, and those who simply wanted the whole controversy to disappear. The division was largely, though not entirely, along racial lines, with most minority residents supporting David and most white residents either defending Karen or staying silent. The most vocal support came from an unexpected source: Margaret Patterson, an elderly white woman who had lived in Millbrook Estates since its development in 1995. She had called David on Tuesday evening, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've been watching that woman terrorize our neighbors for years," she'd said. "I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up sooner. She tried to get me to sign a petition last year. about maintaining neighborhood standards, but I could see what she was really after. I'm too old to be afraid of bullies. Margaret had organized a group of older residents who had witnessed Karen's discriminatory behavior over the years. They had stories dating back to 2018, when Karen had first been elected HOA president on a platform of preserving community character. The pattern had been consistent. Minority families faced excessive scrutiny, while white families were given more lenient treatment for similar violations. The group had approached David with their own documentation, including emails from Karen, that contained increasingly explicit language about maintaining appropriate demographics in the neighborhood. One email, sent to board members in 2019, had been particularly damaging. "We need to be strategic about enforcement. Some families understand our community standards better than others." But Karen had her defenders too. A group of residents had organized counter-protests, arguing that she was being unfairly targeted for doing her job. They claimed that HOA enforcement was necessary to maintain property values, and that David was playing the race card to avoid accountability for legitimate violations. The leader of this group was Tom Henderson, a retired insurance executive who had moved to Millbrook Estates in 2016. He had been one of Karen's strongest supporters and had served on the HOA board for 3 years. His defense of Karen was passionate and personal. "Karen Whitmore is a dedicated volunteer who has given years of her life to this community," he'd told the Herald. "She's being crucified by someone who can't accept that rules apply to everyone, regardless of background. This is a witch hunt, pure and simple." Henderson had organized a petition supporting Karen, gathering 127 signatures from residents who believed she was being unfairly persecuted. The petition claimed that David's accusations were baseless and that his lawsuit was an attempt to silence legitimate HOA enforcement. The divide had become increasingly bitter as more details emerged. When news broke that Karen's husband had profited from property purchases in the neighborhood, her supporters claimed that was irrelevant to her HOA duties. When recordings of Karen's discriminatory phone calls were leaked to the media, they argued that her words were being taken out of context. The tension had reached a breaking point at the February HOA meeting, the first since the story broke. The community center had been packed with nearly 200 residents, far more than the usual attendance of 15 to 20. David had attended with his attorney, while Karen had arrived with her own legal team and a group of supporters. The meeting had lasted for hours and had required police intervention twice. Accusations had flown back and forth, with Karen's supporters accusing David of orchestrating a smear campaign and David's supporters demanding Karen's immediate resignation. "This is exactly what I predicted would happen," Karen had said during her statement to the board. "We're being divided by outside agitators who want to destroy the harmony of our community. I've dedicated 8 years of my life to this neighborhood, and I won't be driven out by false accusations and political correctness." David had responded with quiet dignity, reading from a prepared statement that focused on facts rather than emotions. "I'm not here to destroy anyone or any community. I'm here because I believe in fairness and equal treatment under the law. My wife and I chose this neighborhood because we wanted to be part of a community that welcomed all families. I simply want that promise to be honored." The meeting had ended without resolution, but the damage had been done. The neighborhood that had once prided itself on community spirit was now fractured along lines that might never heal. Property values, ironically, had begun to decline as news of the controversy spread, and several families had already put their homes on the market. The most heartbreaking casualty had been the community's children. The high school where David had sponsored the soccer team was now divided between students who supported him and those who defended Karen. Friendships had been strained, and some families had transferred their children to other schools to avoid the conflict. David had received both death threats and offers of support. His business had been both boycotted and celebrated, with some clients canceling contracts while others specifically sought him out because of his stand against discrimination. The controversy had turned him into a reluctant symbol of both racial justice and community division. But through it all, David had maintained his focus on the evidence. This wasn't about popularity or community harmony. It was about holding people accountable for their actions and ensuring that all families had the right to live in peace, regardless of their race or ethnicity. The investigation was still ongoing, but David knew that the real battle was just beginning. Karen Whitmore might face criminal charges, but the deeper issues of housing discrimination and community prejudice would take much longer to resolve. The truth emerges: the smoking gun arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in March, delivered by a nervous-looking young woman named Jessica Walsh, who had worked as Karen Whitmore's assistant for 2 years. Jessica had been following the news. Coverage of the investigation, and her conscience had finally gotten the better of her. "I have something you need to see," she'd told David over coffee at a downtown cafe, her hands shaking as she opened her laptop. "I probably should have come forward sooner, but I was scared of losing my job. Karen can be intimidating." What Jessica had brought was a digital goldmine. Karen's personal computer files, including spreadsheets, emails, and documents that she had been asked to maintain as part of her administrative duties. The files painted a picture of systematic discrimination that was even more extensive than David had imagined. The most damning evidence was a spreadsheet titled Property Optimization Strategy, which listed every minority-owned property in Millbrook Estates, along with detailed notes about potential violations, family financial situations, and timelines for enforcement actions. The document read like a military campaign plan, with specific tactics for each targeted family. The Chen property was listed as Priority 1, with notes dating back to 2019, high-value lot. Motivated seller potential after wife's diagnosis. Focus on landscaping and structural violations. Time enforcement with medical expenses. Karen had been targeting him for 4 years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah's cancer diagnosis had been the opportunity she'd been waiting for, calculating that a grieving husband would be too distracted to fight back effectively, but there were dozens of other families on the list. The Patels had been targeted because their mortgage was underwater, making them vulnerable to financial pressure. The Martinez family had been selected because their primary breadwinner was self-employed, making their income unstable. The Johnsons had been chosen because they were new to the neighborhood and didn't have established relationships with other residents. Each family had been researched, profiled, and systematically harassed until they reached their breaking point. Jessica had also provided email chains that showed Kieran coordinating with other HOA presidents across the region. The network that Detective Kim had discovered was actually much larger than initially suspected, involving more than 30 communities and hundreds of targeted families. "We call it the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative," one email had read. "The key is to maintain plausible deniability while creating an environment that encourages voluntary relocation. We're not preventing anyone from living here, we're simply maintaining standards that some families find incompatible with their lifestyle preferences." The euphemistic language couldn't hide the reality. This was a coordinated effort to drive minority families out of predominantly white neighborhoods, while profiting from their displacement. The financial records that Jessica provided were equally damning. Karen had been receiving a percentage of profits from Whitmore Properties, LLC, giving her a direct financial incentive to drive out minority families. The scheme had been incredibly lucrative, generating more than $3.2 million in profits over 5 years. But the most shocking revelation was Karen's plan for expansion. She had been negotiating with developers to implement similar schemes in new subdivisions, using HOA regulations as tools of discrimination from the moment neighborhoods were established. The plan would have affected thousands of families across the region. Detective Kim had been ecstatic when David had shared Jessica's evidence. "This is exactly what we needed," she'd told him. "We can now prove intent, coordination, and financial motive. Karen Whitmore isn't just a discriminatory HOA president, she's the head of a criminal enterprise." The evidence had been turned over to federal investigators, who had launched a civil rights investigation under the Fair Housing Act. The case had attracted attention from the Justice Department, which was considering using it as a test case. Wave of lawsuits from affected families. David's attorney had been contacted by 17 families who wanted to join a class action lawsuit against Karen, the HOA, and Whitmore Properties, LLC. The potential damages were in the millions, and the case had attracted the attention of civil rights organizations nationwide. The most significant development had been the involvement of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, both of which had filed complaints with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The case was being treated as a landmark example of modern housing discrimination, with implications that extended far beyond Millbrook Estates. Karen had responded to the escalating investigations by hiring a high-powered defense attorney and launching a public relations campaign aimed at portraying herself as the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt. She had given interviews to conservative media outlets, claiming that she was being persecuted for enforcing legitimate community standards. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her support base was rapidly eroding. Several HOA board members had resigned, and a recall petition was circulating to remove her from office. The community association's insurance company had canceled their policy, and several residents had stopped paying HOA dues in protest. Desperation was her attempt to sell her own house and leave the neighborhood. The property had been on the market for 3 weeks without a single showing, as news of the investigation had made Millbrook Estates a symbol of housing discrimination. David had watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, but the cost to the community had been enormous. Families were leaving, property values were declining, and the neighborhood he had called home for 15 years was fracturing along racial lines. But he had no regrets. The fence that had started this whole controversy still stood in his backyard, exactly as Sarah had designed it. It had become a symbol of resistance against discrimination, a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. The truth had emerged, and there was no going back. Confrontation and revelation. The final confrontation came on a humid Saturday morning in April, when Karen Whitmore made the mistake of showing up at David's house with eviction papers. She had convinced herself that she could still salvage her position by forcing him out of the neighborhood. Despite the mounting evidence against her and the ongoing federal investigation, David had been working in his garden when he heard the car doors slam. He looked up to see Karen striding across his lawn, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Her face was flushed with anger, and she carried a manila envelope like a weapon. "David Chen," she shouted, her voice echoing across the quiet neighborhood. "You have 48 hours to remove that illegal fence and vacate these premises." David stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. Around them, neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. The timing was perfect. Saturday morning, when most residents were home, maximum visibility for what was about to unfold. "Mrs. Whitmore," David said quietly, "I think you should leave. I'm not going anywhere until you sign these papers." She thrust the envelope at him. "This is a formal notice of eviction for multiple HOA violations. You have 48 hours to comply or face legal action." David didn't take the envelope. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began recording. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're trespassing. On my property, you have no legal authority to issue eviction notices, and you know it." "I'm the HOA president," she screamed. "I have every right to enforce community standards." David replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "And you're about to make this much worse for yourself." That's when the second car arrived. Detective Kim and her partner emerged from an unmarked sedan, their timing impeccable. They had been watching Karen's house, waiting for her to make exactly this kind of mistake. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Kim called out, "We need to talk." Karen's face went white. They had clearly not signed up for a confrontation with law enforcement. "I'm not answering any questions without my lawyer present," Karen said, but her voice had lost its authority. "That's your right," Kim replied. "But we have a warrant for your arrest." The words hit the gathering crowd like a physical blow. David felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness. This was what he'd been working toward for months, but seeing it happen still felt surreal. "On what charges?" Karen's attorney demanded. "Conspiracy to violate civil rights, mail fraud, and wire fraud," Kim replied, pulling out handcuffs. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Mrs. Whitmore." As Karen was being read her rights, David noticed something he'd never seen before. She looked small. Stripped of her authority and her bluster, she was just a frightened woman who had gotten in over her head. The neighbors who had once feared her now watched with a mixture of shock and relief. But Karen wasn't finished. As the handcuffs clicked into place, she turned to David with pure hatred in her eyes. "You think you've won," she snarled. "You people will never belong here. This is our neighborhood, our community, and you'll never be welcome no matter what some judge says." The mask was completely off now. The woman who had hidden behind procedural language and community standards was revealing her true nature, in front of 30 witnesses and a recording device. David stepped forward, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Mrs. Whitmore, need you to understand something. This was never about the fence. This was about the principle that all families deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their race or ethnicity." He paused, looking around at the gathered neighbors. "And for the record, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, and I earned my place here through hard work and community service. I've built houses for half the people watching this, sponsored youth sports teams, and served on the planning commission that approved this subdivision." The revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Many residents had no idea about David's extensive community involvement or his role in the neighborhood's development. Every family in this neighborhood, regardless of their background, has the right to live in peace without harassment or discrimination. Detective Kim led Karen toward the police car, but she turned back one more time. "You have no idea what you've done to this community," she said. David shook his head sadly. "No, Mrs. Whitmore, you destroyed it when you decided that some families were more welcome than others. I'm just trying to rebuild it on a foundation of fairness and equality." As the police car pulled away, the crowd began to disperse, but several neighbors approached David, some to shake his hand, others to apologize for not speaking up sooner. The divisions that had torn the community apart were still there. But something had shifted in the dynamic. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had organized support for David, walked over and put her hand on his arm. "I'm sorry it took this long," she said quietly, "but I'm glad you had the courage to fight." David nodded, watching the police car disappear around the corner. "My wife used to say that courage isn't the absence of fire, it's doing what's right. Despite being afraid, I think she would have been proud of what we accomplished here." The fence still stood in his backyard, exactly as Sarah had designed it. However, delayed was still possible. Resolution and reflection 6 months later, David stood in the same backyard where the confrontation had begun, but everything had changed. Sarah's favorite variety and the garden beyond had grown into the sanctuary she had envisioned. The September morning air carried the scent of jasmine and the sound of children playing in the distance. The legal resolution had been swift once. Karen's arrest made headlines. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using the evidence David had provided, and Karen had ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights and fraud charges. She had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $4.7 million. In restitution to affected families, her husband Robert had fled to Costa Rica before he could be arrested. But Whitmore Properties LLC had been dissolved, and its assets seized. Plus legal fees and moving expenses, the HOA itself had been placed under federal oversight. With new leadership elected in a special election that saw the highest turnout in the neighborhood's history, the new board, led by Mrs. Patterson and including 2 families who had been targeted by Karen's scheme, had implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future discrimination. But the most significant change had been in the community itself. The federal investigation had attracted national attention, leading to congressional hearings on HOA discrimination and new federal guidelines for fair housing enforcement. The case had become a landmark example of how housing discrimination could be combated through careful documentation and community organizing. David had testified before Congress in July, sharing his story and advocating for stronger protections against HOA discrimination. His testimony had been viewed more than 2 million times online, and he had received letters from families across the country who had faced similar harassment. The American dream isn't just about owning a home, he had told the congressional committee. It's about having the right to live in that home with dignity and respect, regardless of your race, religion, or country of origin. When we allow discrimination to flourish in our neighborhoods, we betray the fundamental principles this country was built on. The speech had made him a reluctant celebrity, but David preferred to focus on the local impact of his fight. Property values in Millbrook Estates had initially dropped by 12% following the controversy, but they had since recovered as the neighborhood gained a reputation for diversity and inclusion. More importantly, the community had begun to heal. The divisions that had seemed insurmountable during the height of the conflict had gradually given way to a new understanding. Not everyone had come around. Some of Karen's supporters had sold their homes and moved away, but those who remained had largely embraced the changes. The transformation was most visible in the neighborhood's children. The high school soccer team that David sponsored had become a model of integration, with players from 12 different ethnic backgrounds. The team had won the state championship in their division, and David had been invited to speak at their banquet about the importance of diversity in building strong communities. But success had come with a price. David's construction business had suffered initially, losing several contracts from clients who disapproved of his activism. He had also received hundreds of hate messages and several death threats, forcing him to install security cameras and change his phone number twice. The emotional toll had been even greater. Fighting the case had consumed nearly 2 years of his life, time he could have spent grieving Sarah's death and moving forward with his life. There had been nights when he'd wondered if the fight was worth it, when the stress and isolation had seemed overwhelming. Those doubts had been strongest during the winter months, when the legal proceedings had dragged on and the community remained bitterly divided. David had spent many evenings in his home office, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal documents, questioning whether he had made the right choice. But the turning point had come in March, when he'd received a letter from Maria Santos, a young mother whose family had been forced to leave Millbrook Estates in 2020. After months of harassment from Karam, the letter had been simple but profound. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to thank you for fighting for families like mine. We couldn't afford to stay and battle the HOA, but knowing that someone with your resources and determination was willing to stand up for what's right gives me hope that my children will grow up in a more just world. You've shown that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they refuse to accept injustice." The letter had reminded David why he'd started this fight in the first place. It wasn't about revenge or personal vindication. It was about ensuring that other families wouldn't face the same discrimination and harassment that had made his final months with Sarah even more difficult. The fence that had started it all still stood exactly where Sarah had designed it, but it had taken on new meaning. Neighbors now stopped by regularly to admire the garden, and several had asked David to design similar spaces for their own properties. The fence had become a symbol not of division, but of the beauty that could emerge from standing firm in the face of injustice. On this particular September morning, David was hosting a neighborhood barbecue, first such gathering since the controversy began. 37 families had accepted the invitation, including several who had initially supported Karen. The event was modest but meaningful, a sign that the community was ready to move forward. As he watched children playing in the garden while their parents talked and laughed, David felt Sarah's presence strongly. She would have loved this moment, the neighborhood coming together, the flowers blooming exactly as she'd planned. The sense of peace that had finally returned to their home. The fight had been won, but the war against housing discrimination continued. David had joined the board of directors for the Fair Housing Council and was working with federal investigators to identify similar schemes in other communities. The work was time-consuming and often frustrating, but he'd learned that justice required constant vigilance. He'd also learned something else, that ordinary people, armed with patience, documentation, and determination, could challenge systems that seemed insurmountable. The HOA that had once seemed all-powerful had crumbled when confronted with evidence of its corruption. The woman who had terrorized minority families for years had been brought to justice by the very people she had tried to drive away. But perhaps most importantly, David had learned that communities could heal from even the deepest divisions if enough people were willing to do the hard work of reconciliation. The neighborhood that had once been fractured by fear and prejudice was slowly becoming the inclusive community that Sarah had dreamed of as the sun set on the barbecue. David walked back to the fence where it had all begun. The cedar boards were weathered now, aged by 2 years of Texas sun and rain, but they remained strong and straight. Climbing roses covered much of the structure, their blooms adding color and fragrance to the evening air. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the grief and anger, the long months of investigation and legal battles, the community division, and eventual reconciliation. It had been the most difficult period of his life, but also the most meaningful. The fence stood as a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of fighting for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. It was Sarah's final gift to him, but it had become his gift to the community, a reminder that justice, however delayed, was still possible in America. David snarled and headed back toward the house, where his neighbors were cleaning up from the barbecue and making plans for the next gathering. The fight against discrimination would continue, but tonight, at least, there was peace in Millbrook Estates. The fence remained as it always would, a symbol of the truth that no family should be driven from their home because of their race or ethnicity, and in the garden beyond, Sarah's roses bloomed in the fading light, beautiful and resilient, just as she had always been.